Everett Madden, and he's going to tell us about his years of growing up in Steventown. So Everett, it's all yours.
Well, Norma, that's a tough act to follow.
I'm
You
sure
already
you
used up
managed.
about half of my material.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, you can kind of stretch it out a little bit. I'm so sorry.
It started May 9th, 1942. Our next door neighbor, Al Silverdale, came over and harrowed my dad's oat ground so that they could go to the hospital and I would be born. Al was of one of the adjoining farms. Back then, about everything was farms. There was McFeely's on one side, Al on the other, Don Shaw, and Cal Hyatt. And they were all anywhere from 100 to 300 acre blocks. And we mostly got along, and we traded sometimes equipment and labor to help each other. I still live in the old farmhouse that my grandfather bought back in the very early 1900s. And I grew up there with a brother and my parents. They called him Lolly. His name was Lawrence. And Betsy, and my grandmother Margaret, and my grandfather Dan. Everybody sort of had their own niche. My mother raised quite a few chickens. She used to have 200 to 300 chickens every year, which she sold eggs. The neighbor McFeely's to the one side of us, Bill had chickens of his own, and he had an egg route in Pittsfield. And a lot of her eggs went to Pittsfield on the egg route. And the chickens, when they were laid out, she'd butcher them herself and sold a lot of them to Walt Sykes at Sykes' store. I wouldn't worry too much about federal inspectors back then. It's just basement operation. And then, you know, when we got to be junior high school sized kids, we had our own 4-H chicken project. My brother had New Hampshire Reds, and I had White Plymouth Rocks. And the eggs went with the rest of the eggs, and the chickens, well, we had chicken dinner on Sunday quite often. Because my mother, she had polled chickens. They were, you know, all pullets. But the 4-H chickens were just run. You know, you got half roosters and half pullets. And the roosters made chicken dinner. We had about 25 milk cows and some young stock, and when kids got big enough to help, we used to have to help with mostly the young stock. I remember some of my early job was teaching the calves to drink out of a pail. You hold your fingers over their mouth and they suck on your fingers and you cram their head in a pail of milk and away you go. They catch on pretty quick. And teach them to lead. You know, put a halter on them and see who's going to be boss, them or you. You know, I can't believe, you know, we were just little kids. We're out there in a barnyard with 25, 1,500-pound cows. You know, and you're this big and they're that big. Really thought nothing of it. You know, you just, if they didn't agree with you, you kick them in the ribs. You know. So, boss. Things changed a lot early. You know, there was a big period of change that happened, well, from the time, not long after I was born, up until 1960. When I was a little shaver, it was loose hay, and my grandfather still had 2 horses. I remember one of them, his name was Tony. I remember Tony because when I was just a little kid, I was feeding Tony some grass, and he bit my finger. And it bled, and I squalled, and but my grandfather died in 1952, and the horses left about that time. In 1948, we got a hay baler, and that ended the loose hay. And I remember when we still had loose hay, they used to use one of the horses to pull the rope to bring the hay up into the hay mow, and my mother used to set me on the horse. I remember that. But it wasn't long after that the small farm was pretty well done. In the very late 50s, canned milk was on its way out. Everything was going bulk tank. Most of the farmers bought a bulk tank, and it wasn't too long and they were out of business anyway. The cost of doing and what you got back just didn't add up anymore. And now most of the farms today got 300 or 400 milkers, 24-hour operations. Some of Tammy's family up in northern Vermont just got a remote milking parlor. The cows come in, they get on a turntable, the milking machine is attached, it falls off, they go out, they eat, and wander around in the loafing pen. And nobody ever even touches them, which just seems crazy, but it works. 4-H was a big thing back when I was growing up. We had a 4-H club that was Delmer Ellis ran. It was just kind of a handyman 4-H club, and then we had the chicken 4-H club. We had a cattle 4-H club, and me and the Ellis boys used to go somewhere over in the city to a 4-H band, whereas we all played in the high school band. Started school in the Jim Sweet School over here on 43. It just passed the East Road. It's a residence now. And it sure is different than it is now. My first teacher was Teresa Brewer. And half of the first grade we went there, and Helen Hyatt was the teacher for that. The first day of school, when I was just a little shaver, they decided to have a kindergarten, and me and the 2 Ellis boys were the class. Yeah. Well, we show up for school, and didn't I get into a yellow jacket's nest? And they were sure that my school career was doomed at that point, because I got stung and whatever. It was an interesting experience, because we had kindergarten through 6th grade in one room, and it was probably 12 or 14 kids total. And you know, you just listened into what everybody else was doing. It was almost kind of an ungraded situation. You know, it must have been quite a challenge for a teacher to do all that. Like you were talking about Gussie D. Didn't have any running water. We had an outhouse. The building's still there attached to the house, but it's a tool shed or something now. But it was the boys' side and the girls' side, and I don't remember any knot holes in the wall. Back then, I probably wouldn't have been interested anyway. Recess, we'd go out, do whatever, go out, wander around in the woods. And I remember when I was in the first grade, we were having, we called it a chicken fight. Little kids get on the big kid's back, you know, and you go around and you try to knock the other kids off. Well, I was riding on Bruce Stevens, and didn't he drop me in a mud puddle? I was soaked. And Helen Hyatt, not knowing what to do, sent me home. Well, home, you know, I'm a little 5 or 6 year old kid, you know, and home's like 2 miles away. I showed up at home, my mother was fit to be tied. And she and Helen were pretty tight, but they weren't so tight after that. We always raised a big garden. I still do. My mother, my grandmother used to can and freeze. I remember our first freezer we bought down at Sykes' store, probably about around 47, 48. We bought a big old canned milk cooler and put more insulation on it and put it down cellar and made a freezer out of it. Delmer Ellis came up, he was a local refrigeration guy. He came up, tricked the thing up so it would make froze instead of cold, you know, so used it for years. Mostly what I do today, as far as canning, I make pickles, pickled peppers, that kind of stuff. I don't really, I can a few beans. I remember my mother used to put an awful lot of frozen stuff up. Anything you could get in a box that went in the freezer. Some of my early memories, about the same time period, back to 1948, we had the Sheffield Farm Creamery in town. The building's still there, but the milk train, we had a train, but we didn't have a milk train. At that point already, when I can remember, the milk was kind of quick process there in the creamery, and it went in a tractor trailer and went that way. There was no more cans on the train. I know the Rutland Railroad, one of their very early, they had milk trains, you know, to pick up milk, and I don't know where the milk ended up, where the processing plant was. The railroad kind of died a slow, miserable death. Now, I can remember, I vaguely remember the old steamers, and I remember the diesels that replaced them. It was kind of an exciting time when they started putting these big diesel locomotives in. They only ran them for a couple of years before the thing went out of business. But I can remember in my bedroom, looking out the window to the west, you could see back then, you know, there wasn't trees everywhere like there is now. The track ran way over to the other side of Al Silverdale's property, on the other side of 22. And I remember seeing a train going up through there, and I could see the glow in the cab from had the door open, shoveling coal into it. It was kind of neat. And I remember hearing them switching cars down at the depot. You could hear the couplers bang, 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 bang when they were going ahead and backing up. But the labor unions and this stretch of the railroad from Bennington to Chatham really wasn't any freight on it. They built the thing originally in the hopes that they were going to get a lot of through freight that would come down from up north, and it would go to Chatham and then down the Harlem Valley extension, and that never materialized, and it was an expensive track to maintain. It's crooked and it's hilly and it's a lot of bridges, and the Rutland Railroad itself suffered on until 1962. It got done here in 52, but corporately they went on until 62, and they finally abandoned the whole thing, and the state of Vermont took over what was left, and the Vermont Railways, I think, ended up with it. And a lot of the trackage is still there, but it's all pretty well gone. This book that Mrs. Lash loaned me, fascinating book. It's got more doggone interesting stories in it, and pictures, and the history of the railroad. I recommend it highly. Other than that, I don't have a whole lot more to add, I don't think. Covered my personal experience. Oh, well, there is a few other little things, now that I think about it. Talk about stores.
You got 3 minutes.
The stores, well, Norma pretty well covered Sykes' store. There was another store here in town, Whitman's store. And they had the nasty, you know, us kids, we got, 6th grade, we got bicycles, you know, we go out and ride the roads and pick up cans. Back then, there was big bottles, had a nickel deposit, little bottles were 2 cents.
Yeah.
And we'd gather these cans up and go down to Whitman's store, and we'd turn them in so that you could get something. I had a passion for creamsicles, I love creamsicles. They were 10 cents. And then it got to be 12 cents, and then it got to be 15 cents. My budget at that point required that I had to go back to fudgesicles because they were only 6 cents. John Whitman had the world's nastiest soda cooler. It was a water bath soda cooler, and it had you had to put money in it, and it had like a turnstile, and you brought the bottles around through these rails and you pulled them up out. And boy, that thing was, sometimes it was pretty doggone right.
That's why we have the Glenwell beverage bin.
And the other thing, he always had a big wheel of cheese set up on a platform. And he had a cat that used to sleep on the wheel of cheese.
Now, it had a glass cover on it. It had a glass belly.
It had something.
It had a glass cover.
That was the cat's perch.
That was the absolute best cheese ever. It was.
Well, it was delicious.
It was Captain
The people in town used to, you know, John, he was a, you know, a good-hearted sort of a guy, and but anybody go in there and charge whatever they needed. And I remember him saying to somebody one day, when you get done charging, come back and pay for something. Okay, that's about it. Thank you.